What if one of Jesus' closest followers, and perhaps his most trusted, was erased from the Bible? The lost Gospel of Mary Magdalene may reveal why. In the quiet hours when the world settles into darkness and your mind begins to drift, there exists a story that has been whispered in shadows for nearly 2,000 years. A story so profound, so controversial, that it was buried beneath centuries of silence and suppression. Tonight, as you prepare to journey into peaceful sleep, let me share with you the extraordinary tale of a discovery that would shake the very foundations of everything we thought we knew about early Christianity. Picture this moment. The year is 1896, and the dry sands of Upper Egypt hold secrets that have remained hidden since the 4th century. A manuscript dealer in Cairo presents to the world a collection of ancient papyrus fragments written in the Coptic language, their edges worn by time, but their words still legible after 16 centuries of concealment. Among these weathered pages lies something remarkable, something that scholars would debate for generations to come: the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. But who was this Mary, and why would her words be considered so dangerous that they needed to be hidden from the world? As you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, allow your mind to travel back through the mists of time, to an era when the foundations of Christianity were still being formed, when different communities held vastly different understandings of Jesus' teachings, and when the role of women in spiritual leadership was not yet decided by councils and creeds. The fragments we possess today represent only a portion of what was once a complete text. Pages are missing, conversations are incomplete, yet what remains paints a picture so vivid, so compelling, that it challenges our most basic assumptions about the early Christian movement. This is not merely another biblical story relegated to the margins of history. This is a window into a world where Mary Magdalene stands not as a repentant sinner, not as a secondary figure in the shadow of the male disciples, but as someone far more significant than traditional Christianity has ever dared to acknowledge. What you are about to discover as you drift toward sleep is a narrative that was deliberately suppressed, carefully edited out of the official story, and systematically erased from the consciousness of believers for nearly 17 centuries. The implications of what lies within these ancient pages extend far beyond academic curiosity into questions that strike at the heart of religious authority, gender roles in spiritual leadership, and the very nature of divine revelation itself. The Gospel of Mary begins not with the familiar nativity stories or parables we know from the canonical Gospels, but with Jesus already departed from this world, leaving behind a small group of disciples who are struggling to understand the full meaning of his teachings. The scene opens with the disciples gathered together, fearful and uncertain about their future mission. They have been left with instructions to spread the good news, but they are paralyzed by doubt and confusion about how to proceed without their Master's physical presence to guide them. It is in this moment of crisis that Mary steps forward, not as a follower seeking guidance, but as a leader ready to provide it. The other disciples turn to her with questions that reveal something extraordinary about her relationship with Jesus. They ask her to share the special teachings that Jesus had given to her privately, the revelations that he had not shared with the rest of the group. This detail alone should cause us to pause and consider its implications. According to this ancient text, Jesus had chosen Mary as the recipient of his most profound spiritual insights, teaching so advanced that they required a level of spiritual maturity and understanding that apparently surpassed that of his other disciples. She had been granted access to mysteries that remained hidden from Peter, James, John, and the others who would later become the pillars of the early church. The Gospel of Mary presents her not as someone who simply witnessed Jesus' ministry, but as someone who was being prepared for a unique role in carrying forward his most essential teachings. As Mary begins to recount these private revelations in the text, we encounter something that would have been shocking to the religious authorities of later centuries. Jesus, according to Mary's account, had taught that the kingdom of heaven was not a distant realm to be reached after death, but a state of consciousness that could be achieved in this lifetime through direct spiritual experience. He had spoken of the soul's journey through different levels of reality, of powers and principalities that must be overcome, and of a form of salvation that came not through institutional mediation, but through individual spiritual awakening. These teachings, as preserved in Mary's Gospel, emphasize personal revelation over ecclesiastical authority. They suggest that the most profound truths about the divine nature are discovered not through priestly interpretation of Scripture, but through direct spiritual experience available to anyone who achieves the proper state of consciousness. Such ideas would later be branded as heretical by the developing Orthodox Church, which was establishing its authority partly through its role as the exclusive interpreter of divine will. But perhaps even more controversial than these mystical teachings was the simple fact that they were being transmitted through a woman. In Mary's Gospel, we see her not only receiving these advanced spiritual instructions from Jesus, but also being charged with the responsibility of sharing them with the male disciples. This portrayal directly contradicts the later Christian doctrine that would restrict women from teaching or holding authority over men in spiritual matters. The reaction of the male disciples to Mary's teachings, as recorded in the text, provides a fascinating glimpse into the gender dynamics that were already creating tension within the early Christian community. When Mary finishes recounting Jesus' private revelations, the disciples respond with a mixture of gratitude and skepticism. Some are comforted by her words and ready to go forth with their mission, but others, particularly Peter, react with hostility and disbelief. Peter's response in the Gospel of Mary is particularly telling. He questions whether Jesus would really have shared such important teachings with a woman rather than with his chosen male apostles. He expresses doubt about the reliability of Mary's account and suggests that her claims to special revelation are presumptuous. This conflict between Peter and Mary, preserved in these ancient pages, may represent a much larger struggle that was taking place in the early Christian movement between those who accepted women as spiritual leaders and those who sought to restrict religious authority to men. The Gospel of Mary presents us with a version of early Christianity that looks remarkably different from the religion that would eventually emerge as Orthodox doctrine. In this text, we glimpse a community where spiritual authority was based not on gender or institutional position, but on the depth of one's understanding and spiritual attainment. Mary is portrayed as possessing this understanding to a degree that surpasses the male disciples, making her the natural leader in Jesus' absence. This portrayal becomes even more significant when we consider the historical context in which this gospel was written and preserved. The 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Christian era were a time of tremendous diversity in Christian belief and practice. Different communities held widely varying interpretations of Jesus' teachings, and the question of which texts and teachings would be considered authoritative was still very much in dispute. During this period, there were Christian communities that fully accepted women as teachers, prophets, and leaders. The Gospel of Mary may have emerged from such a community, preserving their understanding of Mary Magdalene's role and their acceptance of her spiritual authority. These communities would later be marginalized and eventually suppressed as the institutionalized church consolidated its power and established Orthodox doctrine. The suppression of texts like the Gospel of Mary was not accidental or arbitrary. It represented a deliberate effort to shape Christian identity in ways that supported particular theological and social agendas. By the 4th century, when the biblical canon was being finalized, the Church had already committed to a hierarchical structure that excluded women from positions of authority. Texts that portrayed women as spiritual leaders or teachers were incompatible with this developing institutional framework. The process of canonization involved not just the selection of texts that were considered authentic and inspired, but also the rejection of texts that were seen as threatening to ecclesiastical authority or social order. The Gospel of Mary, with its portrayal of a female spiritual teacher and its emphasis on direct personal revelation over institutional mediation, represented exactly the kind of threat that the developing Orthodox Church sought to eliminate. What makes this suppression particularly significant is not just what was lost, but what was gained by those who controlled the process. By marginalizing texts that portrayed women as spiritual leaders, the Church was able to establish and maintain a system of religious authority that was exclusively male. The official story of Christianity became one in which women played supporting roles as followers and witnesses, but never as teachers or leaders with independent spiritual authority. Yet, the survival of the Gospel of Mary, even in fragmentary form, suggests that there were communities that valued these alternative traditions enough to preserve them, despite the risks involved. The manuscript that surfaced in 1896 had been carefully copied and preserved by someone who believed that Mary's teachings were worth transmitting to future generations, even if they had to remain hidden for centuries. As you continue your journey toward sleep tonight, consider the courage it must have taken for ancient scribes to preserve these controversial texts. They were not simply copying historical documents, but maintaining a form of spiritual resistance against the growing uniformity of Orthodox Christianity. They believed that Mary's voice, and the voices of other women's spiritual leaders, deserved to be heard by future generations, even if their own generation was not ready to accept them. The rediscovery of the Gospel of Mary in the modern era has opened up entirely new questions about the nature of early Christianity and the development of religious authority. The questions that emerge from these ancient fragments extend far beyond simple historical curiosity. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about how religious narratives are shaped, who gets to tell the authoritative story, and what voices are deliberately silenced in the process. As you allow your breathing to slow and your body to relax into the comfort of your bed, let your mind wander through the implications of what these papyrus pages reveal about the earliest Christian communities. When scholars first examined the Gospel of Mary in detail, they discovered something that challenged not just Christian doctrine, but the entire understanding of how spiritual authority operated in the ancient world. The text suggests that Mary Magdalene possessed what the early Christians called gnosis, a Greek word meaning direct spiritual knowledge or insight. This was not knowledge gained through study or instruction, but rather through immediate personal revelation that bypassed the need for external validation or institutional approval. According to the Gospel, Jesus had recognized in Mary a capacity for this direct spiritual perception that exceeded what he found in his male disciples. The text describes private conversations between Jesus and Mary, in which he shared the deepest mysteries of existence, teachings about the nature of the soul, the structure of spiritual reality, and the path to ultimate liberation. These were not simple moral instructions or parables suitable for crowds, but advanced spiritual technology intended for someone capable of implementing and transmitting such profound understanding. The fragmented nature of the surviving text makes it impossible to reconstruct all of these teachings in detail, but what remains suggests a form of Christianity that would be barely recognizable to modern believers. In Mary's account, Jesus speaks of the soul's journey through 7 levels of existence, each guarded by powers that must be overcome through spiritual wisdom rather than ritual observance. He describes a form of salvation that comes not through belief in doctrinal propositions, but through the direct realization of one's true spiritual nature. This emphasis on personal spiritual experience over institutional authority created obvious problems for the developing church hierarchy. Religious institutions derive their power from their role as mediators between the divine and human realms. If individuals could access the highest spiritual truths directly, without need for priestly interpretation or ecclesiastical approval, then the entire foundation of institutional the Gospel of Mary presented an even more specific threat to the emerging Christian power structure. Not only did it promote religious authority would be undermined, but direct spiritual experience over institutional mediation, but it located the supreme spiritual authority in a woman. In the ancient Mediterranean world, religious leadership was almost exclusively a male domain. Mystery cults might include priestesses, but they typically operated under male oversight. Jewish religious practice was thoroughly patriarchal, with women excluded from positions of teaching or authority. Greek and Roman religious traditions, while occasionally honoring female deities, maintained male dominance in actual religious leadership's emergence in Christianity. This cultural context meant that any acceptance of female spiritual authority would have been revolutionary. The Gospel of Mary suggests that such a revolution was indeed taking place in some early Christian communities, with Mary Magdalene serving as a focal point for this radical reimagining of religious leadership. The text portrays her not as an anomaly or exception, but as someone whose spiritual authority was recognized and accepted by at least some of Jesus' followers. The conflict between Mary and Peter preserved in the Gospel may represent a much larger theological and political struggle within early Christianity. Peter's skepticism about Mary's claims to special revelation reflects more than personal jealousy or cultural prejudice. It represents a fundamental disagreement about the nature of spiritual authority itself. Peter, who would later be regarded as the foundation stone of the institutional church, embodies the position that religious authority should flow through established channels and recognized leaders. Mary, by contrast, represents the principle that spiritual authority derives from direct divine connection rather than institutional appointment. This tension between different models of spiritual authority helps explain why the Gospel of Mary was ultimately excluded from the biblical canon. The communities that preserved this text were maintaining a vision of Christianity that was incompatible with the hierarchical, institutionalized religion that was gaining dominance throughout the Roman Empire. As imperial Christianity consolidated its power, alternative voices and traditions were systematically marginalized and eventually suppressed. The process by which certain texts were deemed canonical, while others were rejected as apocryphal, was not simply a matter of determining historical authenticity or theological accuracy. It was a political process that reflected the interests and agenda of those who controlled the institutional apparatus of the Church. Texts that supported the authority of male religious leaders and emphasized the importance of institutional mediation were preserved and promoted. Texts that challenged these principles, regardless of their historical credibility or spiritual insight, were excluded and often destroyed. The Gospel of Mary was not alone in facing this fate. Numerous other early Christian texts that portrayed women as spiritual leaders or emphasized direct spiritual experience over institutional authority were similarly suppressed. The Gospel of Philip, the Acts of Thecla, and various Gnostic texts all presented versions of Christianity that were deemed incompatible with Orthodox doctrine. The systematic exclusion of these texts from the biblical canon effectively erased entire traditions of Christian thought and practice. This erasure had profound consequences that extended far beyond the ancient world. By eliminating texts that portrayed women as spiritual leaders and teachers, the developing church created a scriptural foundation that could be used to justify the exclusion of women from religious authority for centuries to come. The absence of female spiritual leaders in the canonical Gospels was later cited as evidence that such leadership was contrary to divine will, when in fact it may have simply reflected the political interests of those who controlled the canonization process. The rediscovery of the Gospel of Mary and other suppressed texts in the modern era has forced scholars to reconsider fundamental assumptions about early Christian history. Rather than the unified movement presented in traditional church histories, early Christianity emerges as a diverse and often contentious collection of communities with widely varying beliefs and practices. Some of these communities fully embraced women as spiritual leaders and teachers. Others restricted such roles to men. The version of Christianity that eventually became Orthodox doctrine represented the victory of one particular faction, rather than the inevitable unfolding of divine truth. This recognition has implications that extend beyond historical scholarship into contemporary religious life. If the exclusion of women from spiritual leadership was based on political considerations rather than divine mandate, then the theological arguments used to maintain such exclusion lose their foundation. The Gospel of Mary provides evidence that Jesus himself may have recognized and promoted female spiritual authority, making later restrictions appear as human innovations rather than divine commands. But the significance of Mary's Gospel extends beyond questions of gender and religious authority into deeper issues about the nature of spiritual truth itself. The text's emphasis on direct personal revelation challenges not just male religious authority, but all forms of external spiritual authority. It suggests that the most profound spiritual truths cannot be mediated through institutions or transmitted through doctrinal instruction, but must be discovered through immediate personal experience. This understanding resonates with mystical traditions throughout history that have emphasized direct spiritual experience over religious orthodoxy. From the Desert Fathers of early Christianity to the Sufi masters of Islam, from the Kabbalists of Judaism to the contemplatives of medieval Christianity, mystics have consistently reported that the deepest spiritual truths come through direct encounter with the divine rather than through institutional mediation. The Gospel of Mary places this mystical tradition at the very heart of Jesus' teaching, suggesting that what later became institutionalized Christianity may have represented a deviation from rather than a fulfillment of his original message. According to Mary's account, Jesus was not primarily concerned with establishing religious institutions or creating systems of doctrinal authority. Instead, he was teaching specific practices and understandings that would enable individuals to achieve direct spiritual realization. The fragmentary nature of the surviving text prevents us from fully reconstructing these teachings, but the glimpses that remain are tantalizing. Jesus speaks of the need to overcome the powers of wrath, desire, ignorance, and death through spiritual understanding. He describes the soul's journey through different levels of existence and the challenges that must be faced at each level. These descriptions bear striking similarities to the spiritual maps found in various mystical traditions, suggesting that Jesus may have been transmitting a sophisticated technology of consciousness transformation. That such advanced spiritual teachings were being transmitted through a woman would have been remarkable in any ancient context. But it takes on special significance when we consider the role that women played in various mystery traditions of the ancient world. In many esoteric schools, women served as priestesses, oracles, and guardians of sacred knowledge. The Eleusinian Mysteries, one of the most important spiritual traditions of ancient Greece, was presided over by a female hierophant. The oracle at Delphi, perhaps the most famous source of divine revelation in the ancient world, spoke through a woman. The Gospel of Mary may preserve a tradition of Christianity that was more closely connected to these ancient wisdom traditions than the institutionalized religion that later emerged. In this context, Mary Magdalene appears not as an anomaly, but as part of a recognizable pattern in which women served as conduits for the highest forms of spiritual knowledge and revelation. As you drift deeper into the gentle embrace of sleep, imagine the sacred spaces where these ancient wisdom traditions flourished. In temples dedicated to Isis in Egypt, women served as high priestesses, maintaining mysteries that connected the earthly realm with divine consciousness. In the sacred groves where Celtic Druids gathered, female seers channeled prophecies that guided entire tribes. These traditions understood something that later institutional religion would struggle to accept, that spiritual insight often flows most purely through those who remain open to divine mystery, rather than those who seek to control it. The Gospel of Mary suggests that Jesus recognized this same principle when he chose to share his deepest teachings with Mary Magdalene. In the fragmented conversations preserved in the text, we catch glimpses of a teaching relationship that went far beyond anything described in the canonical Gospels. Jesus speaks to Mary not as a teacher instructing a student, but as one spiritual adept communicating with another, sharing insights that require a particular level of consciousness to receive and understand. These private teachings, as Mary recounts them to the other disciples, reveal a Jesus whose spiritual message was far more sophisticated and mystical than traditional Christianity has acknowledged. He speaks of the soul's journey through multiple dimensions of existence, of the need to transcend various forms of spiritual bondage, and of a salvation that comes through direct knowledge of one's divine nature, rather than through belief in external saviors. The disciples' reactions to Mary's revelations provide a window into the theological tensions that were already fracturing the early Christian movement. Some, like Levi, defend Mary's authority and urge the others to listen to her teachings. He recognizes that Jesus had loved Mary more than any of the other disciples, and suggests that this special relationship qualified her to serve as their teacher and guide. His words reveal that at least some of Jesus' followers accepted female spiritual authority as natural and appropriate. But Peter's response exposes the deep resistance that such acceptance would face. His challenge to Mary's claims reflects not just personal jealousy, but a fundamental theological position that would eventually triumph in Orthodox Christianity. Peter represents the view that spiritual authority should flow through established male leadership rather than through direct divine revelation, regardless of the recipient's gender. The argument between Peter and Mary, preserved in this ancient text, may represent the earliest recorded conflict over gender and spiritual authority in Christian history. It suggests that the exclusion of women from religious leadership was not an uncontested development, but was actively debated within the earliest Christian communities. Mary's supporters in this debate were eventually marginalized, but their voices were preserved in texts like this gospel for those who would discover them centuries later. As you allow your breathing to deepen and your mind to settle into peaceful stillness, consider how different Christian history might have been if Mary's faction had prevailed in these early theological debates. Imagine a Christianity in which women regularly served as teachers, prophets, and spiritual directors. Envision religious communities in which spiritual authority was based on wisdom and insight rather than gender and institutional position. Picture a faith tradition that emphasized direct personal revelation over doctrinal conformity. Such a Christianity actually existed in various forms throughout the early centuries of the Church's development. Gnostic communities regularly accepted women as spiritual teachers and leaders. Montanist churches were led by female prophets who claimed direct divine revelation. Even within more orthodox communities, women like Priscilla, Phoebe, and Junia held positions of significant religious authority that were only later diminished or explained away by male church leaders. The Gospel of Mary preserves the memory of this alternative Christianity, offering a glimpse of what was lost when institutional considerations overcame spiritual ones in the development of Orthodox doctrine. The text reminds us that the version of Christianity that became dominant was not inevitable, but was the result of specific historical and political processes that could have unfolded differently. The mystical teachings that Mary claims to have received from Jesus also point toward a form of Christianity that would have developed along very different lines. Instead of emphasizing sin, judgment, and redemption through institutional mediation, this tradition focused on the soul's direct journey toward divine union. Rather than requiring belief in specific doctrinal formulations, it offered practical methods for achieving spiritual transformation through direct experience. These teachings align remarkably with the mystical traditions that developed at the margins of Orthodox Christianity throughout subsequent centuries. The desert fathers and mothers who sought God through contemplative prayer in the Egyptian wilderness, the medieval mystics who described direct encounters with divine love, the contemplatives who found God through inner silence rather than external ritual. All of these traditions echo themes that appear in Mary's fragmentary gospel. The emphasis on overcoming the powers of wrath, desire, ignorance, and death through spiritual understanding reflects a sophisticated psychology of spiritual development that would later appear in various forms throughout Christian mystical literature. The description of the soul's journey through different levels of existence parallels the spiritual maps developed by contemplatives from Pseudo-Dionysius to John of the Cross. What makes Mary's version particularly significant is its suggestion that these advanced spiritual teachings were part of Jesus' original message rather than later developments within Christian tradition. According to the Gospel of Mary, Jesus was not primarily concerned with establishing institutional religion, but with transmitting specific practices and understandings that would enable direct spiritual realization. This perspective challenges not just the historical development of Christianity, but the fundamental understanding of what Jesus' mission was intended to accomplish. Instead of founding a religion, he may have been establishing a school of spiritual development. Rather than creating an institution to mediate divine grace, he may have been teaching methods for direct divine encounter. The implications of this understanding extend far beyond academic theology into questions about the nature of spiritual authority and religious truth. If Jesus' deepest teachings were indeed focused on direct spiritual experience rather than doctrinal belief, then the entire foundation of institutional Christianity requires re-examination. The Gospel of Mary suggests that the early Christian movement included communities that understood this mystical dimension of Jesus' teaching and organized themselves accordingly. These communities would have looked very different from the hierarchical institutions that later emerged. They would have been more like spiritual schools or mystery traditions, focused on the practical work of consciousness transformation rather than the maintenance of doctrinal orthodoxy. The suppression of texts, like the Gospel of Mary, represented not just the elimination of alternative theological perspectives, but the erasure of entire approaches to spiritual development. The communities that preserved these texts were maintaining practices and understandings that connected them directly to the mystical heart of Jesus' original teaching. As you continue your journey toward peaceful sleep, allow yourself to imagine what it might have been like to participate in one of these early mystical Christian communities. Picture gathering with other seekers in simple homes or hidden caves, sharing the advanced spiritual teachings that Mary had received directly from Jesus. Imagine practicing the contemplative methods that were designed to overcome the powers that bind the soul and achieve direct union with divine consciousness. These communities would have been places of profound spiritual transformation, where individuals learned to navigate the subtle dimensions of existence that Jesus had mapped out in his private teachings. They would have been schools of consciousness where students learned not just to believe certain propositions about God, but to experience divine reality directly through their own spiritual development. The women in these communities would not have been relegated to supporting roles, but would have served as teachers, prophets, and guides for others seeking the same direct spiritual experience. Mary Magdalene would have been remembered not as a repentant sinner or faithful follower, but as the primary transmitter of Jesus' most profound spiritual insights. The survival of Mary's gospel, even in fragmentary form, suggests that somewhere in the ancient world there were people who valued these teachings enough to preserve them, despite the obvious risks involved. As Orthodox Christianity consolidated its power and began actively suppressing alternative traditions, maintaining texts like the Gospel of Mary required considerable courage and commitment. The scribes who copied these manuscripts were not simply preserving historical documents, but maintaining a form of spiritual resistance. They believed that Mary's voice and the mystical tradition she represented deserved to survive for future generations, who might be ready to receive and understand these teachings. Their faith in the value of this preservation has been vindicated by the modern rediscovery of these texts and the profound questions they raise about the nature of early Christianity. The Gospel of Mary and similar suppressed texts have opened entirely new avenues of research and understanding that continue to transform our knowledge of Christian origins. But beyond their historical significance, these texts offer something even more valuable to contemporary seekers. They provide access to spiritual teachings and practices that were systematically eliminated from mainstream Christian tradition, but that retain their transformative power for anyone willing to explore them seriously. The mystical Christianity preserved in Mary's Gospel offers an alternative to both fundamentalist literalism and secular dismissal of religious truth. It suggests that spiritual traditions can be simultaneously ancient and contemporary, rooted in historical revelation, yet directly accessible through personal experience. As your mind begins to release its grip on the concerns of the day and your body settles into the deep relaxation that precedes sleep, let yourself be carried by the gentle current of this ancient wisdom. The Gospel of Mary reminds us that the most profound spiritual truths are not locked away in institutional vaults, but are available to anyone who approaches them with the proper preparation and sincere desire for understanding. The teachings that Mary received from Jesus and transmitted to his other disciples were not intended for a select few, but for anyone capable of receiving them. They represent a technology of consciousness that transcends the boundaries of any particular religious tradition, while honoring the specific historical context in which they were first revealed. Tonight, as you surrender to the natural rhythm of sleep, you join a lineage of seekers that stretches back through Mary Magdalene to the source of all spiritual wisdom. The same divine consciousness that spoke through Jesus to Mary continues to whisper its secrets to anyone willing to listen with the ears of the heart rather than the judgments of the mind. In the quiet spaces between waking and sleep, where consciousness begins to dissolve into the deeper mysteries of existence, we find ourselves drawn to the most profound questions about the nature of spiritual truth itself. The Gospel of Mary doesn't merely challenge our understanding of early Christian history. It invites us into a completely different way of perceiving the relationship between divine wisdom and human consciousness, between teacher and student, between the seen and unseen dimensions of spiritual reality. As your breathing naturally slows and your body releases the tensions accumulated throughout the day, allow your mind to drift back to those ancient communities where Mary's teachings were first shared and preserved. Picture the flickering oil lamps casting dancing shadows on stone walls as small groups of seekers gathered in secret to explore the deeper mysteries that Jesus had revealed to his most trusted disciple. These weren't casual Bible studies or theological discussions. They were initiatory experiences where participants learned to navigate the subtle dimensions of consciousness that Mary had mapped through her direct encounters with divine truth. The fragmentary conversations preserved in Mary's Gospel reveal something extraordinary about the nature of spiritual instruction in these earliest Christian communities. When Jesus speaks to Mary about the soul's journey through different levels of existence, he's not offering philosophical speculation or poetic metaphor. He's providing precise spiritual technology, detailed instructions for consciousness transformation that require both theoretical understanding and practical application to master fully. Consider how radically different this approach was from the religious instruction that would later characterize institutional Christianity. Instead of emphasizing belief in doctrinal propositions or adherence to moral codes, these teachings focused on direct experiential knowledge of spiritual reality. Students weren't asked to accept theological arguments on faith, but were given specific practices and contemplative methods that would enable them to verify spiritual truths through their own inner experience. Mary's role as the primary recipient and transmitter of these advanced teachings suggests something profound about her spiritual development and natural capacity for mystical perception. The text implies that Jesus recognized in her a level of consciousness that was uniquely suited for receiving and preserving the most essential aspects of his spiritual message. This wasn't favoritism or romantic attachment, but spiritual recognition of the highest order. The private conversations between Jesus and Mary, as preserved in the Gospel fragments, reveal a teaching relationship that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, Jesus appears to be sharing specific information about the structure of spiritual reality and the challenges that souls face in their journey toward divine union. But beneath these explicit teachings runs a deeper current of transmission that operates through direct energetic connection rather than verbal instruction. This form of spiritual transmission, known in various mystical traditions as direct pointing or immediate recognition, bypasses the ordinary processes of intellectual understanding and speaks directly to the awakened consciousness within the student. It requires a particular quality of receptivity and spiritual maturity that apparently Mary possessed to an exceptional degree. The other disciples' reactions to Mary's account of these private teachings reveal how challenging this form of direct spiritual transmission was for those who approached spiritual truth primarily through intellectual analysis or institutional authority. Peter's skepticism reflects more than cultural prejudice against female spiritual leadership. It represents a fundamental difference in understanding about how divine knowledge is transmitted and received. Peter embodies the approach to spiritual truth that would eventually dominate Orthodox Christianity, an approach that emphasizes external validation, institutional authority, and collective agreement about doctrinal propositions. Mary represents a completely different paradigm, one that prioritizes direct inner experience, immediate spiritual perception, and individual verification of spiritual truths through contemplative practice. The tension between these two approaches to spiritual authority wasn't simply a personal conflict between two individuals, but represented competing visions of what the Christian movement would become. Peter's faction eventually prevailed, establishing the institutional structures and hierarchical authority that would characterize Christianity for the next 2 millennia. Mary's approach, with its emphasis on direct spiritual experience and individual mystical development, was gradually marginalized and eventually suppressed. Yet the survival of Mary's gospel suggests that there were communities throughout the early Christian period that maintained this alternative understanding of Jesus' essential message. These groups would have functioned more like mystery schools or contemplative orders than the congregational churches that became the norm in mainstream Christianity. Their focus would have been on practical spiritual development rather than doctrinal conformity. The contemplative practices implied in Mary's gospel bear remarkable similarities to methods found in various mystical traditions throughout history. The emphasis on overcoming specific spiritual obstacles through direct recognition rather than moral effort echoes techniques found in Tibetan Buddhism, Hindu Vedanta, and Islamic Sufism. This suggests that Jesus may have been transmitting universal principles of consciousness transformation rather than culturally specific religious doctrines. The description of the soul's journey through different levels of existence, each guarded by particular powers that must be transcended through spiritual understanding, provides a sophisticated map of consciousness development that parallels the spiritual psychology found in advanced contemplative traditions. These aren't symbolic or metaphorical descriptions, but practical instructions for navigating the subtle dimensions of awareness that become accessible through sustained spiritual practice. What makes Mary's preservation of these teachings particularly significant is the precision with which they address the specific challenges that arise in advanced spiritual development. The powers of wrath, desire, ignorance, and death that Jesus describes aren't external enemies to be fought, but internal limitations that must be transcended through direct recognition of their illusory nature. This understanding reflects a remarkably sophisticated approach to spiritual transformation that recognizes both the reality of these limitations and the possibility of their complete transcendence through proper understanding and practice. It suggests a form of Christianity that was deeply psychological in its approach, focused on the actual mechanics of consciousness transformation rather than external religious observances. The communities that preserved and practiced these teachings would have developed forms of spiritual direction and contemplative guidance that were far more individualized and experientially based than anything found in later institutional Christianity. Students would have worked with experienced teachers who could guide them through the specific challenges and opportunities that arise in mystical development. Mary's role as the primary teacher and guide in these communities would have been based entirely on her demonstrated capacity for spiritual realization, rather than any external appointment or institutional authorization. Her authority would have derived from her direct experience of the states of consciousness that Jesus had revealed to her, and her proven ability to guide others toward similar realization. The systematic suppression of these contemplative Christian communities represents one of the greatest losses in Western spiritual history. The elimination of texts like Mary's Gospel wasn't simply the rejection of alternative theological perspectives, but the destruction of entire approaches to spiritual development that had proven their effectiveness over centuries of practice. The institutional Christianity that emerged from this suppression maintained many of the external forms of religious practice, but lost access to the inner spiritual technology that had been the heart of Jesus' original teaching. Prayer became petition rather than contemplative absorption. Scripture study became intellectual analysis rather than mystical reflection. Religious community became social organization rather than spiritual companionship in the deepest work of consciousness transformation. Yet the rediscovery of Mary's Gospel in the modern era coincides with a renewed interest in contemplative spirituality that transcends denominational boundaries. Contemporary practitioners of Christian mysticism, Buddhist meditation, and various forms of contemplative inquiry are rediscovering the same territories of consciousness that Mary's Gospel describes, often through direct experience rather than historical study. This convergence between ancient mystical texts and contemporary spiritual exploration suggests that the teachings preserved in Mary's Gospel represent timeless principles of consciousness development rather than historically limited religious doctrines. The spiritual technology that Jesus transmitted to Mary remains as relevant and effective today as it was 2,000 years ago. As you continue your gentle descent into the peaceful depths of sleep, consider how the rediscovery of these ancient contemplative teachings might be part of a larger awakening that's occurring in human consciousness. The same spiritual principles that Mary received and preserved are becoming accessible to contemporary seekers through various forms of mystical practice and direct spiritual inquiry. The fragmented conversations preserved in her Gospel serve as windows into dimensions of spiritual possibility that remain available to anyone willing to undertake the patient work of consciousness transformation. The powers that Jesus described as obstacles to spiritual realization continue to operate in contemporary consciousness, but so do the methods for transcending them through direct spiritual understanding. Modern practitioners of contemplative spirituality often report experiences that align remarkably with the descriptions found in Mary's Gospel: the journey through different levels of consciousness, the encounter with various forms of spiritual resistance, and the ultimate recognition of the soul's divine nature are as accessible today as they were in the earliest Christian communities. This suggests that Mary's Gospel isn't simply a historical document, but a living transmission that continues to offer guidance and inspiration to contemporary spiritual seekers. The teachings that Jesus shared with her privately weren't intended only for first-century audiences, but represent universal principles of spiritual development that transcend cultural and historical limitations. The emphasis on direct personal experience over external religious authority that characterizes Mary's approach to spiritual truth resonates particularly strongly with contemporary approaches to mystical development. Modern practitioners often find that the most profound spiritual insights arise not through religious instruction or theological study, but through direct contemplative practice and immediate spiritual recognition. This convergence between ancient mystical Christianity and contemporary spiritual exploration creates unprecedented opportunities for recovering the contemplative dimensions of Christian tradition that were lost during the centuries of institutional suppression. The Gospel of Mary serves as a bridge between the original mystical teachings of Jesus and the spiritual needs of contemporary seekers who are hungry for direct spiritual experience. The women and men who preserved Mary's Gospel through centuries of persecution and suppression were maintaining more than alternative theological perspectives. They were keeping alive a complete approach to spiritual transformation that recognized the fundamental capacity of human consciousness for direct divine realization. Their dedication to preserving these teachings reflects a profound understanding of their value for future generations of spiritual seekers. They recognized that the contemplative Christianity represented in Mary's Gospel offered something essential that was being lost in the development of institutional religion, something that would eventually need to be recovered for the spiritual development of humanity. The courage required to maintain these teachings in the face of active suppression and persecution reveals the depth of commitment that characterized these contemplative Christian communities. They weren't simply preserving interesting historical documents, but were maintaining living traditions of spiritual practice that continued to produce direct spiritual realization in their practitioners. The scribes who copied and preserved Mary's Gospel were themselves contemplative practitioners who understood the value of these teachings through their own spiritual development. Their careful preservation of even fragmentary portions of the text reflects their recognition that every word contained precious guidance for the work of consciousness transformation. Modern scholars who study these ancient contemplative texts often report that their academic research gradually transforms into spiritual practice as they encounter the living power of the teachings they're investigating. The Gospel of Mary seems to retain its capacity for spiritual transmission even across the barriers of time, language, and cultural difference. This suggests that the text functions as more than historical documentation, but serves as a form of spiritual technology that continues to operate effectively for anyone who approaches it with proper preparation and sincere spiritual intention. The contemplative practices implied in Mary's Gospel remain as powerful and relevant today as they were when first transmitted by Jesus to his most advanced disciple. The rediscovery of these ancient mystical teachings coincides with a growing recognition that spiritual development requires more than intellectual understanding or emotional devotion. Contemporary practitioners of various contemplative traditions are rediscovering the need for precise spiritual methods and experienced guidance in the work of consciousness transformation. Mary's Gospel provides access to exactly this kind of sophisticated spiritual technology, preserved from the earliest Christian communities where contemplative practice was understood to be the heart of spiritual development. The teachings that Jesus shared with her privately offered detailed guidance for the advanced work of mystical realization that remains as challenging and rewarding today as it was 2 millennia ago. As your consciousness continues its natural movement toward the deep peace of sleep, allow yourself to feel connected to this ancient lineage of contemplative practitioners who maintained the mystical heart of Christian spirituality through centuries of suppression and persecution. Their dedication to preserving these teachings makes it possible for contemporary seekers to access spiritual methods and understandings that might otherwise have been lost forever. The Gospel of Mary reminds us that the most profound spiritual truths are transmitted not through institutional authority or doctrinal instruction, but through direct spiritual recognition between teacher and student, between one awakened consciousness and another that is ready to receive and embody the same realization. Tonight, as you surrender to the natural rhythm of rest and renewal, you participate in the same mystery that Mary experienced in her most intimate conversations with Jesus. The divine consciousness that spoke through him to her continues to whisper its secrets to anyone who learns to listen with the deep receptivity that characterized her spiritual development. The teachings preserved in her gospel aren't historical curiosities, but living transmissions that remain available to anyone willing to undertake the patient work of consciousness transformation that they describe. The same spiritual principles that guided Mary's development continue to operate for contemporary practitioners who approach them with the same sincerity and dedication that characterize the contemplative Christian communities where her teachings were first received and preserved. In the gentle stillness of this sacred narrative, as your consciousness drifts between the known and unknown realms of spiritual understanding, we find ourselves drawn deeper into the profound implications of what Mary's preserved teachings reveal about the very nature of divine transmission itself. The fragments that survived the centuries of systematic suppression contain within them not merely alternative theological perspectives, but glimpses into a completely different understanding of how spiritual wisdom moves from teacher to student, from one awakened heart to another ready to receive its deepest truths. As you allow your breathing to find its natural rhythm and your body to release into the comfort of complete relaxation, imagine the sacred intimacy of those private conversations between Jesus and Mary that the Gospel preserves for us. These weren't casual discussions or public teachings delivered to crowds seeking miracles or moral instruction. They were initiatory transmissions occurring in the liminal spaces between ordinary consciousness and direct divine recognition, where the deepest mysteries of existence could be shared without the filters of cultural expectation or institutional interpretation. The Gospel of Mary suggests that these intimate teachings were transmitted through what mystics throughout history have recognized as direct spiritual perception, rather than conceptual instruction. Jesus wasn't simply sharing information with Mary about the nature of spiritual reality. He was awakening within her consciousness the capacity to perceive these truths directly through her own immediate spiritual experience. This form of teaching, known in various contemplative traditions as direct pointing or immediate recognition, bypasses the ordinary processes of intellectual understanding and speaks directly to the awakened awareness that exists within every human soul. What makes Mary's reception of these teachings particularly remarkable is the depth of spiritual maturity and receptivity that such transmission requires. The text implies that Jesus recognized in her not simply an eager student or devoted follower, but a consciousness that was already sufficiently developed to receive and preserve the most essential aspects of his spiritual message. This recognition suggests that Mary's spiritual development had reached a level that enabled her to serve as a perfect vessel for these advanced teachings. The private revelations that Mary recounts to the other disciples reveal a form of spiritual instruction that was far more sophisticated and experientially based than anything found in the canonical Gospels. Instead of parables designed for general audiences or moral teaching suitable for beginners, these conversations address the specific challenges and opportunities that arise in advanced contemplative practice. They provide detailed guidance for navigating the subtle dimensions of consciousness that become accessible only through sustained spiritual development. The resistance that Mary encounters when she attempts to share these teachings with the male disciples reflects more than simple cultural prejudice or personal jealousy. It represents a fundamental conflict between different approaches to spiritual authority and religious truth. Peter's skepticism embodies the institutional approach that would eventually dominate Christianity, an approach that emphasizes external validation, collective agreement, and hierarchical authority structures over direct personal spiritual experience. Mary's position represents a completely different paradigm, one that recognizes the primacy of immediate spiritual perception over all forms of external religious authority. Her teaching suggests that the most profound spiritual truths cannot be mediated through institutional structures or validated through collective consensus, but must be discovered and verified through individual contemplative practice and direct mystical experience. This tension between institutionally mediated religion and direct mystical experience has persisted throughout the history of all major spiritual traditions. In every religious context, there have been those who emphasized the importance of external religious observance, doctrinal conformity, and institutional authority, and those who prioritized immediate spiritual experience, contemplative practice, and direct divine communion. The conflict between Mary and Peter preserved in this ancient text may represent the earliest recorded instance of this perennial tension within Christian tradition. The communities that preserved Mary's gospel were maintaining a form of Christianity that remained connected to the mystical dimensions of Jesus' original teaching. These weren't simply alternative theological perspectives or competing interpretations of Christian doctrine. They represented entirely different approaches to spiritual development that recognized contemplative practice and direct spiritual experience as the heart of authentic religious life. The contemplative methods implied in Mary's teachings bear remarkable similarities to the advanced spiritual practices found in various mystical traditions throughout history. The emphasis on transcending specific forms of spiritual bondage through direct recognition rather than moral effort echoes the approach found in non-dual contemplative traditions across different cultures and historical periods. This suggests that Jesus may have been transmitting universal principles of consciousness transformation rather than culturally specific religious doctrines. The description of the soul's journey through different levels of existence that Mary preserves provides a sophisticated map of consciousness development that parallels the spiritual psychology found in advanced contemplative traditions. These aren't symbolic representations or poetic metaphors, but practical instructions for navigating the subtle dimensions of awareness that become accessible through sustained mystical practice. Each level of existence described in Mary's account corresponds to specific states of consciousness and particular challenges that arise in advanced spiritual development. The powers that must be transcended at each level aren't external obstacles to be overcome through effort or struggle, but internal limitations that dissolve naturally through proper understanding and direct spiritual recognition. This approach to spiritual transformation reveals a form of Christianity that was deeply psychological in its understanding of human consciousness and remarkably precise in its methods for facilitating consciousness development. The communities that practiced these teachings would have developed sophisticated forms of spiritual direction and contemplative guidance that were far more individualized and experientially based than anything found in later institutional Christianity. The systematic suppression of these contemplative Christian communities represents a profound loss not only for Christian tradition, but for the entire development of Western spirituality. The elimination of texts like Mary's Gospel and the persecution of the communities that preserved them destroyed centuries of accumulated wisdom about consciousness transformation and mystical development that had proven its effectiveness through generations of contemplative practice. The institutional Christianity that emerged from this suppression retained many of the external forms of religious practice, but lost access to the inner spiritual technology that had been the essence of Jesus' original teaching. Religious observance became primarily concerned with moral behavior and doctrinal belief rather than consciousness transformation and direct spiritual realization. Yet the rediscovery of Mary's gospel in the modern era coincides with a remarkable renewal of interest in contemplative spirituality that transcends denominational boundaries and cultural limitations. Contemporary practitioners of various mystical traditions are rediscovering the same territories of consciousness that Mary's gospel describes, often through direct spiritual experience rather than historical study or theological analysis. This convergence between ancient contemplative texts and modern mystical practice suggests that the teachings preserved in Mary's gospel represent timeless principles of spiritual development rather than historically limited religious doctrines. The spiritual methods that Jesus transmitted to Mary remain as relevant and effective today as they were 2,000 years ago. Modern practitioners who engage seriously with contemplative practice often report experiences that align remarkably with the descriptions found in Mary's gospel. The journey through different states of consciousness, the encounter with various forms of spiritual resistance, and the ultimate recognition of the soul's divine nature are as accessible to contemporary seekers as they were to the earliest Christian contemplatives. This suggests that Mary's gospel functions as more than historical documentation, but serves as a living transmission that continues to offer practical guidance for consciousness transformation. The teachings that Jesus shared with her privately weren't intended only for first-century audiences, but represent universal principles of mystical development that transcend cultural and historical limitations. The emphasis on direct personal experience over external religious authority that characterizes Mary's approach to spiritual truth resonates particularly strongly with contemporary approaches to contemplative practice. Modern mystics often discover that the most profound spiritual insights arise not through religious instruction or theological study, but through immediate spiritual recognition and direct contemplative experience. As you continue your gentle journey toward the deep peace of restorative sleep, consider how the rediscovery of these ancient mystical teachings might be part of a larger awakening that's occurring in human consciousness. The same spiritual principles that Mary received and transmitted are becoming accessible to contemporary seekers through various forms of contemplative inquiry and direct spiritual practice. The women and men who risked their lives to preserve Mary's teachings through centuries of persecution and suppression were maintaining more than alternative religious perspectives. They were keeping alive a complete understanding of human spiritual potential and practical methods for actualizing that potential through sustained contemplative practice. Their dedication to preserving these teachings reflects a profound recognition of their value for future generations of spiritual seekers. They understood that the contemplative Christianity represented in Mary's gospel offered something essential that was being systematically eliminated from institutional religion, something that would eventually need to be recovered for the continued spiritual evolution of humanity. The courage required to maintain these teachings in the face of active suppression reveals the depth of realization that characterized these contemplative communities. They weren't simply preserving interesting theological alternatives, but were maintaining living traditions of spiritual practice that continued to produce direct mystical realization in their practitioners. The scribes, who carefully copied and preserved Mary's gospel, were themselves advanced contemplative practitioners who understood the transformative power of these teachings through their own spiritual development. Their meticulous preservation of even fragmentary portions of the text reflects their recognition that every preserved word contained invaluable guidance for the work of consciousness transformation. Contemporary scholars who study these ancient contemplative texts often report that their academic research gradually transforms into spiritual practice as they encounter the living transmission that these teachings continue to carry. The Gospel of Mary seems to retain its capacity for spiritual awakening even across the barriers of time, language, and cultural difference. This suggests that the text operates as a form of spiritual technology that continues to function effectively for anyone who approaches it with proper preparation and genuine spiritual sincerity. The contemplative practices implied in Mary's Gospel remain as powerful and transformative today as they were when first transmitted by Jesus to his most spiritually mature disciple. The rediscovery of these ancient mystical teachings coincides with a growing recognition among contemporary spiritual practitioners that authentic spiritual development requires more than intellectual understanding or emotional devotion. There is an increasing awareness of the need for precise contemplative methods and experienced guidance in the advanced work of consciousness transformation. Mary's Gospel provides access to exactly this kind of sophisticated spiritual guidance, preserved from the earliest Christian communities where contemplative practice was understood to be the very heart of spiritual development. The teachings that Jesus shared with her privately offered detailed instruction for the advanced work of mystical realization that remains as challenging and rewarding today as it was 2 millennia ago. The contemplative communities that preserved Mary's teachings maintained practices and understandings that connected them directly to the mystical essence of Jesus' original message. Their approach to spiritual development was based on direct experience rather than doctrinal belief, on immediate spiritual recognition rather than intellectual analysis, on contemplative practice rather than religious observance. These communities would have functioned more like advanced spiritual schools than congregational churches, with experienced teachers providing individualized guidance to students at different stages of contemplative development. The focus would have been on the practical work of consciousness transformation rather than the maintenance of theological correctness or institutional loyalty. Mary's role in these communities would have been that of a master teacher, whose authority derived entirely from her demonstrated capacity for direct spiritual realization and her proven ability to guide others toward similar awakening. Her teachings would have been received not as doctrinal propositions to be believed, but as practical instructions for contemplative practice to be implemented and verified through direct spiritual experience. The systematic elimination of these contemplative Christian traditions represents one of the most significant losses in the history of Western spirituality. The destruction of communities that had maintained effective methods for consciousness transformation and direct mystical realization impoverished the entire spiritual development of Western civilization for centuries. Yet the survival of texts like Mary's Gospel suggests that the essential wisdom of these traditions was never completely lost, but was preserved in hidden forms that would eventually become available to future generations of spiritual seekers. The rediscovery of these teachings in the modern era provides unprecedented opportunities for recovering the contemplative dimensions of Christian spirituality that were suppressed during the institutional consolidation of orthodox doctrine. The convergence of ancient contemplative wisdom and contemporary mystical practice creates possibilities for spiritual development that transcend the limitations of both historical and modern approaches to religious truth. The Gospel of Mary serves as a bridge between the original mystical teachings of Jesus and the spiritual needs of contemporary seekers who hunger for direct spiritual experience rather than institutional mediation. As your consciousness continues its natural descent into the profound stillness of sleep, allow yourself to feel deeply connected to this ancient lineage of contemplative practitioners who maintained the mystical heart of spiritual truth through centuries of suppression and persecution. Their unwavering dedication to preserving these teachings makes it possible for contemporary seekers to access spiritual wisdom and contemplative methods that might otherwise have been lost forever. The Gospel of Mary reminds us that the most profound spiritual truths are transmitted not through institutional authority or theological instruction, but through direct recognition between awakened consciousness and receptive awareness, between one who has realized the deepest spiritual truths and another who is prepared to receive and embody the same realization. The teachings that Jesus shared with Mary in those intimate conversations continue to whisper their secrets to anyone who develops the same quality of spiritual receptivity and contemplative dedication that characterized her remarkable spiritual development. The divine consciousness that spoke through him to her remains eternally present and available to anyone who learns to listen with the profound stillness and openness that contemplative practice gradually cultivates. Tonight, as you surrender completely to the natural rhythm of rest and spiritual renewal, you participate in the same mystery of divine transmission that connected Jesus and Mary in those sacred moments of ultimate spiritual intimacy. The contemplative awareness that enabled her to receive and preserve his deepest teachings lives within your own consciousness, waiting to be awakened through the patient practice of inner stillness and spiritual receptivity. The ancient wisdom preserved in Mary's Gospel continues to offer its transformative guidance to anyone willing to approach it with the same sincerity and dedication that characterize the contemplative Christian communities where these teachings were first received, practiced, and lovingly preserved for seekers like yourself who would discover them across the vast expanse of centuries. In the gentle embrace of approaching sleep, feel yourself held by this eternal transmission of mystical wisdom that flows from awakened consciousness to awakened consciousness, from the deepest spiritual realization to hearts that are open and ready to receive the timeless truth that Mary Magdalene preserved for us through her profound love and unwavering dedication to the contemplative path that Jesus revealed to her in the sacred intimacy of direct spiritual recognition. As your mind drifts deeper into the tranquil spaces between waking and sleep, we find ourselves drawn to consider the profound questions that Mary's Gospel raises about the very nature of divine truth and its transmission through human consciousness. The fragmentary conversations preserved in this ancient text don't merely offer alternative perspectives on early Christian history. They invite us into a radically different understanding of how spiritual wisdom moves from the infinite realm of divine consciousness into the finite world of human experience and understanding. Allow your breathing to slow naturally as you contemplate the extraordinary implications of what these papyrus fragments reveal about the relationship between teacher and student in the deepest work of spiritual transformation. The private revelations that Mary received from Jesus weren't simply advanced theological concepts or esoteric spiritual information. They were living transmissions of consciousness itself, direct transfers of awakened awareness that bypassed the ordinary processes of intellectual learning and spoke immediately to the deepest levels of spiritual understanding. The text suggests that these intimate teaching sessions occurred in states of consciousness that transcended ordinary waking awareness. Mary's reception of Jesus' most profound insights appears to have taken place in the liminal spaces between normal human consciousness and direct divine perception, where the boundaries between teacher and student, between human and divine awareness, became permeable enough to allow complete spiritual transmission. Consider how different this understanding is from the pedagogical approaches that would later characterize institutional Christianity. Instead of emphasizing the memorization of doctrinal propositions or the development of theological arguments, these private teachings focused on the direct awakening of spiritual perception within Mary's consciousness. Jesus wasn't trying to convince her intellectually of certain spiritual truths. He was awakening within her the capacity to perceive these truths directly through her own immediate spiritual experience. The contemplative practices implied in Mary's Gospel reveal a sophisticated understanding of consciousness development that recognizes both the universal principles governing spiritual awakening and the highly individualized nature of each person's journey toward divine realization. The specific challenges that souls encounter in their movement through different levels of spiritual understanding aren't arbitrary obstacles, but represent the natural stages through which consciousness must pass in its return to divine awareness. The powers of wrath, desire, ignorance, and death that Jesus describes to Mary aren't external enemies to be fought through moral effort or religious observance. They represent internal limitations of consciousness that dissolve naturally when met with the proper quality of spiritual understanding and recognition. This approach to spiritual transformation reflects a remarkably mature psychology of consciousness development that understands both the reality of these limitations and the precise methods through which they can be transcended. As you allow your body to settle more deeply into the comfort of complete relaxation, imagine the sacred atmosphere that must have surrounded these private teaching sessions between Jesus and Mary. These weren't casual conversations or informal discussions about spiritual matters. They were initiatory transmissions occurring in specially prepared states of consciousness where the deepest mysteries of existence could be shared without the distortions of cultural conditioning or personal limitations. The intimacy described in these fragmentary accounts suggests a level of spiritual communion that transcended all ordinary categories of relationship. Mary wasn't simply Jesus' student or even his closest disciple. She was his spiritual companion in the deepest work of consciousness exploration, someone whose own spiritual development had reached a level that enabled her to participate fully in the most advanced aspects of his mystical realization. This understanding challenges not only traditional Christian assumptions about Mary Magdalene's role, but the entire framework through which we understand spiritual authority and religious transmission. The text suggests that the highest forms of spiritual wisdom aren't transmitted through institutional hierarchies or official religious appointments, but through direct recognition between awakened consciousness and receptive awareness. The resistance that Mary encountered when she attempted to share these teachings with the male disciples reflects more than cultural prejudice about women's spiritual capabilities. It represents a fundamental conflict between two completely different approaches to spiritual truth and religious authority. The disciples who questioned Mary's account were operating from an understanding that spiritual authority should flow through established channels and recognized male leadership structures. Mary's position embodied a radically different paradigm that recognized the primacy of direct spiritual experience over all forms of external validation or institutional approval. Her teaching suggested that the most profound spiritual truths couldn't be mediated through religious institutions or validated through collective consensus, but had to be discovered and verified through individual, contemplative practice and immediate mystical recognition. This tension between institutionally mediated religion and direct spiritual experience would eventually be resolved in favor of the institutional approach. But the communities that preserved Mary's gospel were maintaining an alternative understanding that remained connected to the original mystical dimensions of Jesus' teaching. These weren't simply different theological perspectives, but entirely different approaches to spiritual development and religious life. The contemplative communities that practiced the teachings preserved in Mary's gospel would have functioned more like advanced spiritual schools than congregational churches. Their primary focus would have been on the practical work of consciousness transformation, rather than doctrinal instruction or religious observance. Students would have worked with experienced teachers who could provide individualized guidance based on their specific stage of spiritual development and particular contemplative needs. Mary's role in these communities would have been that of a master teacher, whose authority derived entirely from her demonstrated capacity for direct spiritual realization and her proven ability to facilitate similar awakening in others. Her teachings would have been received not as theological propositions to be believed, but as practical instructions for contemplative practice to be implemented and verified through direct spiritual experience. The spiritual methods implied in Mary's gospel reveal an understanding of consciousness development that was far more sophisticated and experientially based than anything found in later institutional Christianity. Instead of emphasizing external religious observances or moral behaviors, these practices focused on the direct recognition of consciousness itself and the gradual dissolution of all limitations that prevent complete spiritual awakening. The journey through different levels of existence that Mary describes provides a detailed map of the stages through which consciousness passes in its return to divine awareness. Each level corresponds to specific states of mystical realization and particular challenges that naturally arise in advanced contemplative practice. The powers that must be transcended at each stage aren't external obstacles, but internal limitations that dissolve through proper spiritual understanding. This approach to spiritual transformation reveals a form of Christianity that was deeply contemplative in its essence and remarkably precise in its methods for facilitating consciousness development. The communities that maintained these practices would have developed sophisticated traditions of spiritual direction that were based on direct experience rather than theoretical knowledge or institutional authority. The systematic suppression of these contemplative Christian traditions represents one of the most significant losses in Western spiritual history. The elimination of communities that had maintained effective methods for consciousness transformation and direct mystical realization impoverished the spiritual development of Western civilization for centuries, creating a form of Christianity that retained the external forms of religious practice but lost access to its contemplative essence. Yet the survival of Mary's gospel suggests that the essential wisdom of these traditions was preserved in hidden forms that would eventually become available to future generations of spiritual seekers. The rediscovery of these teachings in the modern era provides unprecedented opportunities for recovering the mystical dimensions of Christian spirituality that were lost during the institutional consolidation of Orthodox doctrine. Contemporary practitioners of various contemplative traditions often report experiences that align remarkably with the spiritual territories described in Mary's Gospel. The states of consciousness, the challenges of spiritual development, and the ultimate recognition of divine nature that characterize these ancient mystical communities remain as accessible today as they were 2,000 years ago. This suggests that the contemplative methods preserved in Mary's Gospel represent timeless principles of consciousness transformation rather than historically limited religious practices. The spiritual technology that Jesus transmitted to Mary continues to operate effectively for anyone who approaches it with proper preparation and genuine spiritual commitment. Modern mystics who engage seriously with contemplative practice discover that the most profound spiritual insights arise not through intellectual study or theological analysis, but through direct spiritual recognition and immediate mystical experience. The same quality of consciousness that enabled Mary to receive Jesus' deepest teachings remains available to contemporary practitioners who develop the necessary spiritual receptivity and contemplative dedication. The communities that risked everything to preserve Mary's gospel were maintaining more than alternative theological perspectives. They were keeping alive a complete understanding of human spiritual potential and practical methods for actualizing that potential through sustained contemplative practice. Their dedication to preserving these teachings reflects a profound recognition of their transformative value for future generations. As your consciousness continues its natural movement toward the deep stillness of regenerative sleep, consider how the rediscovery of these ancient contemplative teachings might be part of a larger awakening occurring in human spiritual development. The same principles of consciousness transformation that Mary received and transmitted are becoming accessible to contemporary seekers through various forms of mystical practice and direct spiritual inquiry. The courage required to maintain these teachings through centuries of active persecution reveals the depth of spiritual realization that characterized the contemplative communities where Mary's gospel was preserved. They weren't simply maintaining interesting historical documents, but were keeping alive living traditions of spiritual practice that continued to produce direct mystical awakening in their practitioners. The scribes, who carefully copied and preserved these fragmentary texts, were themselves advanced contemplatives who understood the transformative power of these teachings through their own spiritual development. Their meticulous preservation of every available word reflects their recognition that each preserved phrase contained invaluable guidance for the work of consciousness transformation. Contemporary researchers who study these ancient mystical texts often report that their academic investigation gradually transforms into spiritual practice as they encounter the living transmission that these teachings continue to carry. The Gospel of Mary seems to retain its capacity for spiritual awakening, even across the vast expanses of time, language, and cultural difference. This suggests that the text functions as a form of spiritual technology that continues to operate effectively for anyone who approaches it with the proper preparation and sincere spiritual intention. The contemplative practices implied in Mary's Gospel remain as powerful and relevant today as they were when first transmitted by Jesus to his most spiritually mature disciple. The rediscovery of these ancient contemplative teachings coincides with a growing recognition among modern spiritual practitioners that authentic development requires more than intellectual understanding or emotional devotion. There is an increasing awareness of the need for precise mystical methods and experienced guidance in the advanced work of consciousness transformation. Mary's Gospel provides access to exactly this kind of sophisticated spiritual instruction, preserved from the earliest Christian communities where contemplative practice was understood to be the very heart of authentic religious life. The teachings that Jesus shared with her privately offer detailed guidance for the advanced work of mystical realization that remains as challenging and transformative today as it was 2 millennia ago. The emphasis on direct personal experience over external religious authority that characterizes Mary's approach resonates particularly strongly with contemporary approaches to spiritual development. Modern contemplatives often discover that the most profound insights arise not through religious instruction or institutional guidance, but through immediate spiritual recognition and direct mystical practice. The convergence between ancient contemplative wisdom and modern mystical experience creates unprecedented opportunities for spiritual development that transcend the limitations of both historical and contemporary approaches to religious truth. The Gospel of Mary serves as a bridge between the original mystical teachings of Jesus and the spiritual needs of contemporary seekers who hunger for direct experience rather than institutional mediation. The women and men who preserved Mary's teachings through centuries of suppression were maintaining something far more precious than alternative religious perspectives. They were keeping alive a complete understanding of the contemplative path and practical methods for consciousness transformation that had proven their effectiveness through generations of mystical practice. Their unwavering dedication to preserving these teachings makes it possible for contemporary practitioners to access spiritual wisdom and contemplative methods that might otherwise have been lost forever. The Gospel of Mary reminds us that the most profound spiritual truths are transmitted not through institutional channels but through direct recognition between awakened awareness and receptive consciousness. The divine wisdom that spoke through Jesus to Mary continues to whisper its secrets to anyone who develops the same quality of spiritual receptivity and contemplative openness that characterized her remarkable spiritual development. The contemplative awareness that enabled her to receive and preserve his deepest teachings lives within every human consciousness, waiting to be awakened through the patient practice of inner stillness and spiritual dedication. Tonight, as you surrender completely to the natural rhythm of restorative sleep, you participate in the same mystery of spiritual transmission that connected Jesus and Mary in those sacred moments of ultimate intimacy. The mystical awareness that flows from awakened consciousness to receptive hearts transcends all boundaries of time and circumstance, remaining eternally available to anyone who approaches it with genuine sincerity and contemplative commitment. The ancient wisdom preserved in Mary's Gospel continues to offer its transformative guidance to seekers who are willing to undertake the same patient work of consciousness development that characterized the contemplative Christian communities where these teachings were first received and lovingly maintained. In the gentle stillness of approaching sleep, feel yourself embraced by this eternal stream of mystical transmission that flows from the deepest spiritual realization into hearts that are prepared to receive and embody its timeless truth. The Gospel of Mary stands as a testament to the enduring power of contemplative wisdom to transcend all attempts at suppression and control. The spiritual technology that it preserves remains as fresh and effective today as it was when first transmitted between teacher and student in the sacred intimacy of direct spiritual recognition. As consciousness naturally releases its grip on the activities of the day, allow yourself to rest in the profound peace that comes from touching, however briefly, the same mystical awareness that enabled Mary Magdalene to receive, preserve, and transmit the deepest secrets of divine consciousness across the vast expanse of human history. In the hushed sanctuary of your evening rest, as the world outside grows quiet and your mind begins to release the day's concerns, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of an even deeper mystery. The fragments of Mary's Gospel that survived the centuries of suppression contain within them not merely alternative religious perspectives, but something far more profound and transformative. They offer us glimpses into the actual mechanics of spiritual awakening itself, the precise methods through which ordinary human consciousness can be transformed into direct divine awareness. As you settle more comfortably into the embrace of approaching sleep, allow your imagination to drift back to those hidden communities where Mary's teachings were not just preserved, but actively practiced. Picture small groups of sincere seekers gathering in remote caves and humble dwellings, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of oil lamps as they shared the contemplative methods that Mary had received directly from Jesus himself. These weren't theological discussions or academic debates about religious doctrine. They were practical sessions devoted to the actual work of consciousness transformation. The spiritual exercises implied in Mary's Gospel reveal an understanding of human consciousness that was centuries ahead of its time. The text describes specific techniques for recognizing and transcending the various forms of mental and emotional bondage that prevent the soul from realizing its divine nature. These weren't symbolic or metaphorical instructions, but precise spiritual technology designed to produce measurable changes in the practitioner's state of awareness and spiritual capacity. Consider how radically different this approach was from the religious practices that would later characterize institutional Christianity. Instead of emphasizing external observances like ritual participation or moral compliance, these teachings focused on the direct transformation of consciousness itself. Students weren't asked to believe certain propositions about God or salvation, but were given specific methods for experiencing divine reality directly through their own inner development. The communities that maintained these practices would have developed sophisticated systems of spiritual guidance that were highly individualized and experientially based. Each student would have worked with experienced teachers who could assess their particular stage of consciousness development and provide customized instruction appropriate to their specific needs and capabilities. This wasn't one-size-fits-all religious programming, but precision spiritual education adapted to the unique requirements of each individual soul. Mary's role in these communities would have been extraordinary by any historical standard. As the primary repository of Jesus' most advanced teachings, she would have served as the ultimate spiritual authority, the living link to the source of these transformative methods. Her guidance would have been sought not because of institutional appointment or cultural tradition, but because of her demonstrated mastery of the consciousness states and spiritual capacities that these teachings were designed to develop. The private conversations between Jesus and Mary that the Gospel preserves offer tantalizing glimpses into the actual content of these advanced spiritual instructions. The fragmented accounts describe Jesus explaining the subtle structure of spiritual reality, the various levels of consciousness through which the awakening soul must pass, and the specific challenges and opportunities that arise at each stage of development. These weren't philosophical speculations about the nature of existence, but practical maps of consciousness territories that Jesus had explored through his own spiritual development. He was sharing with Mary the actual geography of mystical experience, providing her with detailed guidance for navigating the subtle dimensions of awareness that become accessible through sustained contemplative practice. The powers and principalities that Jesus describes in these private teachings represent the various forms of psychological and spiritual resistance that naturally arise when consciousness begins to transcend its ordinary limitations. Each of these powers corresponds to specific patterns of mental and emotional conditioning that must be recognized and transcended for spiritual awakening to occur. The remarkable sophistication of this psychological understanding suggests that Jesus possessed not only profound spiritual realization, but also detailed knowledge of the mechanisms through which consciousness transformation actually occurs. His instructions to Mary reveal an understanding of human psychology that wouldn't be matched by academic psychology for nearly 2 millennia. The contemplative methods implied in these teachings bear striking similarities to advanced practices found in various mystical traditions throughout history. The emphasis on direct recognition rather than gradual development, on immediate spiritual perception rather than progressive learning, aligns with the approach found in the most sophisticated contemplative schools across different cultures and historical periods. This suggests that Jesus may have been transmitting universal principles of consciousness transformation that transcend the boundaries of any particular religious tradition. The spiritual technology preserved in Mary's Gospel represents timeless methods for awakening human consciousness to its divine nature, methods that remain as effective today as they were 2,000 years ago. As your breathing continues to slow and deepen naturally, imagine what it must have been like for Mary to receive these extraordinary teachings directly from their source. Picture her sitting in rapt attention as Jesus revealed the innermost secrets of spiritual development, sharing with her the precise understanding that had enabled his own complete awakening to divine consciousness. These weren't casual conversations or informal sharing sessions, but intensive training periods where the deepest mysteries of existence were being transmitted from one fully awakened consciousness to another that was prepared to receive and preserve them. The intimacy described in these accounts reflects not romantic attachment, but the profound spiritual communion that occurs when teacher and student meet at the deepest levels of mystical understanding. The fragments that survived suggest that these teaching sessions often occurred in altered states of consciousness, where ordinary mental activity was suspended and direct spiritual transmission became possible. Mary's reception of Jesus' most profound insights appears to have taken place in the liminal spaces between normal human awareness and pure divine consciousness, where the boundaries between individual minds dissolve and direct knowledge transfer can occur. This understanding of spiritual transmission through consciousness states, rather than verbal instruction, explains why these teachings were so difficult for the other disciples to accept and understand. They were operating from ordinary mental awareness and couldn't comprehend instruction that had been received and was being transmitted through completely different states of consciousness. The resistance that Mary encountered when she attempted to share these teachings reflects more than cultural prejudice about women's spiritual capabilities. It represents the natural difficulty that arises when advanced spiritual insights are transmitted to those who haven't developed the consciousness states necessary to receive and understand them properly. Peter's skepticism embodies the challenge that all mystical traditions face when attempting to share direct spiritual experience with those who are still operating primarily through intellectual analysis and cultural conditioning. His response reveals the fundamental gap that exists between consciousness-based spiritual understanding and belief-based religious thinking. The communities that preserved Mary's gospel were maintaining bridges across this gap, developing methods for transmitting consciousness-based spiritual insights to students at various stages of development. They would have created carefully structured environments where individuals could gradually develop the spiritual capacity necessary to receive and embody these advanced teachings. The contemplative practices implied in Mary's Gospel would have been designed to prepare students systematically for the consciousness states in which direct spiritual transmission becomes possible. These weren't casual meditation techniques or simple prayer practices, but sophisticated methods for transforming the fundamental structure of human awareness. The systematic suppression of these contemplative communities represents the elimination of entire approaches to spiritual development that had proven their effectiveness through centuries of practice. The destruction of these traditions removed from Western civilization precise methods for consciousness transformation that wouldn't be rediscovered until the modern renewal of interest in contemplative spirituality. Yet the survival of Mary's Gospel suggests that the essential wisdom of these traditions was preserved in forms that would eventually become available to future generations of spiritual seekers. The rediscovery of these teachings in the contemporary era coincides with a renewed recognition of the importance of direct spiritual experience and consciousness-based approaches to religious development. Modern practitioners who engage seriously with contemplative practice often report experiences that align remarkably with the spiritual territories described in Mary's Gospel. The states of consciousness, the challenges of spiritual development, and the ultimate recognition of divine nature that characterize these ancient mystical communities remain as accessible today as they were in the earliest Christian period. This suggests that the contemplative technology preserved in Mary's teachings represents universal principles of human consciousness development rather than historically limited religious practices. The methods that Jesus transmitted to Mary continue to operate effectively for anyone who approaches them with proper preparation and genuine spiritual commitment. Contemporary research in consciousness studies and contemplative neuroscience is beginning to validate many of the insights about human awareness and spiritual development that were preserved in these ancient mystical texts. The sophisticated understanding of consciousness states and transformation processes that Mary's Gospel contains is being rediscovered through modern scientific investigation of contemplative practices. The convergence between ancient mystical wisdom and contemporary consciousness research creates unprecedented opportunities for understanding both the historical significance of these suppressed teachings and their continued relevance for modern spiritual development. Mary's Gospel serves as a bridge between the original contemplative dimensions of Jesus' teaching and the spiritual needs of contemporary seekers. As your mind continues its natural descent toward the peaceful depths of regenerative sleep, consider how the rediscovery of these ancient contemplative teachings might be part of a larger awakening occurring in human consciousness development. The same principles of spiritual transformation that Mary received and transmitted are becoming accessible to modern practitioners through various forms of mystical practice and direct spiritual inquiry. The women and men who risked everything to preserve these teachings through centuries of persecution were maintaining something far more precious than alternative theological perspectives. They were keeping alive complete systems of consciousness transformation that had demonstrated their effectiveness through generations of contemplative practice. Their dedication to preserving Mary's Gospel reflects a profound understanding of its transformative potential for future generations of spiritual seekers. They recognized that these teachings contained practical methods for spiritual development that would eventually be needed again as human consciousness evolved toward greater spiritual sophistication and mystical awareness. The courage required to maintain these traditions in the face of systematic suppression reveals the depth of spiritual realization that characterized the contemplative communities where Mary's teachings were preserved. They weren't simply maintaining historical documents, but were keeping alive living transmissions of consciousness that continued to produce direct spiritual awakening in their practitioners. The scribes who carefully copied these fragmentary texts were themselves advanced contemplatives who understood the power of these teachings through their own spiritual development. Their meticulous preservation of every available word reflects their recognition that each phrase contained invaluable guidance for the work of consciousness transformation. Modern scholars who study these ancient contemplative texts often report that their academic research gradually transforms into spiritual practice as they encounter the living transmission that these teachings continue to carry. Mary's Gospel seems to retain its capacity for consciousness, awakening even across vast expanses of time and cultural difference. This suggests that the text functions as more than historical documentation, but serves as active spiritual technology that continues to operate effectively for anyone who approaches it with appropriate preparation and sincere spiritual intention. The contemplative practices implied in Mary's Gospel remain as powerful and transformative today as they were when first transmitted by Jesus to his most spiritually developed disciple. The rediscovery of these ancient mystical teachings coincides with growing recognition among contemporary spiritual practitioners that authentic development requires sophisticated understanding of consciousness, states, and precise methods for facilitating spiritual transformation. There is increasing awareness of the need for experienced guidance and proven techniques in the advanced work of mystical realization. Mary's Gospel provides access to exactly this kind of sophisticated spiritual instruction, preserved from the earliest Christian communities where contemplative practice was understood to be the essential heart of authentic religious life. The teachings that Jesus shared with her privately offer detailed guidance for advanced consciousness work that remains as relevant and challenging today as it was 2 millennia ago. The emphasis on direct personal experience over external religious authority that characterizes Mary's approach resonates particularly strongly with contemporary approaches to spiritual development. Modern contemplatives consistently discover that the most profound insights arise through immediate spiritual recognition and direct mystical practice rather than through institutional instruction or theological study. The convergence between ancient contemplative wisdom and modern consciousness exploration creates possibilities for spiritual development that transcend the limitations of both historical and contemporary approaches to religious truth. Mary's Gospel serves as a living bridge between the original mystical dimensions of Jesus' teaching and the spiritual aspirations of contemporary seekers who hunger for direct experience rather than institutional mediation. In the gentle stillness of approaching sleep, feel yourself connected to this ancient lineage of contemplative practitioners who maintained the mystical heart of spiritual truth through centuries of suppression and persecution. Their unwavering dedication to preserving these teachings makes it possible for contemporary seekers to access spiritual wisdom and consciousness transformation methods that might otherwise have been lost to human civilization. The Gospel of Mary reminds us that the most profound spiritual truths are transmitted not through institutional hierarchies or doctrinal instruction, but through direct recognition between awakened consciousness and receptive awareness. The divine wisdom that spoke through Jesus to Mary continues to whisper its secrets to anyone who develops the quality of spiritual receptivity and contemplative dedication that characterized her extraordinary spiritual development. The contemplative awareness that enabled Mary to receive and preserve Jesus' deepest teachings exists within every human consciousness, waiting to be awakened through patient practice of inner stillness and spiritual openness. The same mystical capacity that made her the perfect vessel for these advanced teachings remains available to contemporary practitioners who are willing to undertake the transformative work of consciousness development. Tonight, as you surrender completely to the natural rhythm of restorative sleep, you participate in the same mystery of spiritual transmission that connected Jesus and Mary in those sacred moments of ultimate teaching and reception. The stream of mystical wisdom that flows from awakened consciousness to receptive hearts transcends all boundaries of time and circumstance, remaining eternally present for anyone who approaches it with genuine sincerity and contemplative commitment. The ancient wisdom preserved in Mary's Gospel continues to offer its transformative guidance to seekers willing to engage the same patient work of consciousness development that characterized the contemplative Christian communities where these teachings were first received and lovingly maintained. In the profound peace that comes from touching the depths of mystical awareness, rest in the knowledge that the same divine consciousness that enabled Mary Magdalene to receive and transmit the deepest secrets of spiritual awakening continues to operate through anyone who opens their heart to its eternal presence and transformative power. The implications of Mary's preserved wisdom extend far beyond the boundaries of any single religious tradition or historical period. As your consciousness drifts through the gentle currents of approaching sleep, consider how these ancient fragments point toward universal principles of spiritual awakening that transcend the limitations of cultural context or institutional interpretation. The contemplative methods that Jesus transmitted to Mary weren't designed exclusively for first-century Palestinian communities, but represent timeless technologies of consciousness that remain as effective today as they were 2 millennia ago. Modern neuroscientists studying contemplative states are beginning to identify the precise brain mechanisms that facilitate the kinds of spiritual experiences described in Mary's Gospel. Advanced practitioners of various mystical traditions report achieving states of awareness that align remarkably with the consciousness territories that Jesus mapped out in his private conversations with Mary. This convergence between ancient wisdom and contemporary understanding suggests that we may be approaching a period of unprecedented integration between spiritual insight and scientific knowledge. The communities that risked everything to preserve Mary's teachings understood something profound about the cyclical nature of human spiritual development. They recognized that periods of suppression and concealment would eventually give way to times of rediscovery and renewal. Their careful preservation of these fragments across centuries of persecution reflects an unshakable faith that future generations would develop the spiritual sophistication necessary to receive and implement these advanced teachings. As you allow your body to sink deeper into the comfort of complete relaxation, imagine the sacred trust that connected these ancient preservers with contemporary seekers like yourself. They couldn't have known the specific circumstances under which their hidden treasures would eventually be discovered, but they maintained absolute confidence that the divine wisdom they were protecting would find its way to those who needed it most. And so, as the veil of sleep draws gently over your consciousness, you carry with you the profound recognition that truth has its own mysterious way of surfacing across the centuries. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene stands not merely as an ancient curiosity, but as a testament to the enduring power of authentic spiritual wisdom to transcend every attempt at suppression. In the quiet depths of your rest tonight, may you find yourself connected to that eternal stream of seekers who have always known that the most sacred truths are often found not in the official narratives, but in the whispered testimonies of those who dared to preserve what others sought to destroy. Sleep peacefully, knowing that somewhere in the darkness between history and mystery, Mary's voice continues to echo, reminding you as that divine wisdom has always found ways to speak through those willing to listen with the deepest chambers of their hearts.